Jordan. I was saying that as I read that, this is a perfect sermon. It tells you what's going to happen, and it tells you what happened, and it tells you again to review it, and then it tells you a fourth time. It repeated it 4 times. This is what's going to happen. The name of this sermon is Take a Back Seat, Kohathites. Lots of Christians have lost their usefulness because of pride. Vanity can't be your spiritual gift. Pride can't be your spiritual gift. Hard-headedness can't be your spiritual gift. God wants you to be humble, and those who are find a place in God's story. Now let me start with some humble and not so humble stories to set the stage for the Bible account of Joshua and the Kohathites. In Chuck Swindoll's book, he tells about President Carnes and how humble he was. He always, when he was going into a room, he would step aside and let other people go in ahead of him. Like they were more important. And there was a story where leaders were on a stage, and he started up the steps like they are here, and people started applauding. And he stopped and went back down the steps and let the person behind him go up, thinking that they were applauding for him. It never occurred to him that they were giving him honor. Well, I said, I like this guy. I thought, he's a great guy. I'm going to check on the internet about President Carnes. So I looked it up, and the only thing I could find was a Scottish guy named John Carnes, who was a pastor, and then a professor, and then a principal of a university. I'm not sure it's the same person. And if it is, he died in 1892, and he was right to be humble, because no one knows who he is now. If you asked a dozen people who President Carnes would be, you'd get a blank stare. Proper for him to be humble. Another story of humility. Thomas Hardy was a famous novelist and poet, and any newspaper would pay anything he asked to be able to have the privilege of printing one of his poems or short stories in their newspaper. But because of his humility, he always sent a stamped, self-addressed envelope, so if the editor said, this is not worthy of my paper, they could send it back. In spite of the fact that everyone knew he was the most famous, and he was more important and more famous than whoever that editor was, he allowed that maybe that editor knew more than he did about his own newspaper. The last one has humility and not so humility. Humble and not humble. A group of English tourists in the 30s were at a house that Beethoven lived in. And so they were getting the tour. This is Beethoven's house. And they were walking through, and they came into this room, and there was a piano. And the guy was very quiet. He said this very quietly, very reverently. This is the piano where Beethoven played. And it was like everyone would be in awe. But this woman, young woman, pushed through the crowd of people, came up, sat down at the piano, and played one of his sonatas. And she played for a minute or so, and then she said to the guide and the people there, do lots of people enjoy playing Beethoven's piano? And so the guide told this story. He said, well, a year ago, Ignace Podorotsky, and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, was here last summer with a group of other people, and they pressured him to play on Beethoven's piano. But he said, no, I could not. I'm not worthy. So just to tell you how this guy, Podorotsky, I put in my sermon, Moncton, the spell check says that's not a real spelling. I put in Hillsborough, that's not a real spelling. I put in Podorotsky, proper spelling. he died probably in the 40s or 50s. This spell check knows it. This is what the President of the United States in 32 said. Let me read this sentence. In 1932, American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt called him a modern immortal. And 2 years later, in a book written by Charles Phillips, The Story of a Modern Immortal, we read in the introduction that it is difficult to write of Jodorowsky without emotion. Statesman, orator, pianist, and composer. He is a superlative man, and his genius transcends that of anyone I've ever known. I just picked one sentence. It went on and on about how wonderful he was. So, here he was, the most famous pianist of his time. Also, he was the president of Poland for a while. And he thought of himself as unworthy to be able to sit at the piano that was owned and played by Beethoven. Yet this young girl with pedestrian skills just walked up, didn't ask anybody, sat down and played. You gotta love pride, don't you? You give people a little power and it goes to their heads. And it's true in religion and in government and the military. And in the military, it's the worst possible place because in every war, people have died because of pride. I was listening to something about how U.S. built things for the war. They built incredible amount of things. They would put out a plane, B-28 or 24, the Lancaster bomber, out the door once an hour. But anyway, during the Second World War, in the Battle of the Pacific, these landing ships, the little landing crafts, were found to be totally unworkable on the beaches because there was reefs and stuff in the Pacific. And so it was dangerous. The guys couldn't get them to shore, and so they were in the water. It said in that operation, from getting to the sea to the shore, the deaths went up 1,000%. It was awful. And this man, Andrew Jackson Higgs, read about it, and maybe he saw some video at a movie theater, and he said, I can do something about that, because what they need is the boats that I make. He made swamp boats to be used in Louisiana, and they could load heavy loads and deliver them in less than 2 feet of water. He said, that'll work perfect. So he went to the Navy Department, and he thought that they'd they didn't accept him with open arms. In fact, they sent him away. They chased him off. And he didn't give up that easy. He built a prototype and took that to the Navy Department, and they chased him away. And to rub salt into the wound, they ordered 2,000 more of the landing crafts that wouldn't work. So he got mad. He couldn't see these young 18-year-old people, soldiers, going off to war and being killed unnecessarily. So he went to the Senate and he made a stink. And they assigned his complaint to Senator Harry Truman. And he started to make things happen. He made the War Department, the Navy Department, says, look, we're going to have a test. We're going to put the two boats side by side in real conditions and see who wins. Well, the new boat won hands down. There wasn't even a contest. And Harry tore a strip over the Navy Department for their willingness to have soldiers and sailors die just to keep their pride, because they had designed the boat. Well, we're going to use our design. We're not going to take anybody else's. Nope. Well, this wasn't Joshua. And I hope that you'll see it wasn't the Kohathites. And they took a cue from his example and stepped aside just the same way Principal Carnes did, to let others do it because God said that's the way it's going to be done. Well, number one is the all new stuff. Verse 3 to 6 says, and he commanded the people, saying, when you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, with the Levitical priests carrying it, then you shall set off from your place and go after it. However, there shall be between you and it a distance of about 2,000 cubits by measure. Cubits, not cubits. Do not come near it, that you may know the way in which you should go, for you have not passed this way before. Then Joshua said to the people, consecrate yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. And Joshua said to the priests, saying, take up the ark of the covenant and cross over ahead of the people. So they took up the ark of the covenant and went ahead of the people. Now, this was the time of all sorts of new things happening. Of course, the most important thing was they were crossing the Jordan to go into the promised land. They'd waited 40 years, but now this new thing was going to happen. But here's another new thing. They had, for 40 years, they followed a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, and that was all done. Now they were going to follow the Ark of the Covenant. That was all over. The second new thing is the duty of carrying the ark was no longer the duty of the Kohathites. I'm going to jump back to Numbers 4, verse 4, and it says, this is the work of the descendants of the Kohathites, in the tent of the meeting concerning the most holy of things. And it goes on to say that the table, the bread, they cover up with the cloth, and the lampstand, and all the rest of it. And in verse 15 it says, when Aaron and the sons have finished covering the holy objects, all the furnishings of the sanctuary, when the camp is to set off, after that the sons of Kohath shall come to carry them, so that it will not touch the holy objects and die. These are the things in the tent of meeting, which the sons of Kohath will carry. Now, their duty was to carry all this stuff. The lampstand, the table, the bread set on, where the sacrifices, and most important, the ark. Well, they still got to carry the rest of the holy things, but no longer the ark. That was not theirs anymore. Another new thing that they called for in the next couple pages, if you turn to through 4 and 5, is the fact that they had crossed the sea. They were ready to go to Jericho, and God says, no, I got something you need to do. You need to be circumcised. For the last 40 years, all through the time of no one had been circumcised. So when all these men should have been standing guard, soldiers ready to be, in case they were attacked by all these people, no, they were going to be sacrificed, circumcised, which was a sacrifice, because for a week or 2 or 3, they wouldn't be able to do anything. But because of they hadn't done it for 40 years, it had to be done. And another new thing that happened was that after they were circumcised, the time came for the Passover, and they had broken the law for the last 40 years. Those who took part in both men and women, everyone took part, but the men had to be circumcised, and for the last 40 years, people had broken that law. They were supposed to. They had to. No, just broke that law. Well, this is the first time in 40 years that they obeyed it properly. One other thing, it says after they were circumcised and after the Passover, they had unleavened bread and they ate cakes that were from the products of the land. And the next day, the manna ended. That was the end of the manna. They weren't going to have that anymore. They didn't need it. Number 2, honor and glory. Honor and glory. Verse 7 says, now the Lord said to Joshua, this day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that just as I have been with Moses, I will be with you. Honor and glory is one of those things that people will do bad things to get. All sorts of things. Just a story that's happening today, this week. In Australia, they're having one of the tournaments for tennis. And this is a tournament for all the best players in the world. And one of the guys is Novak Djokovic. He's the leading male tennis player in the world. He's won all sorts. He's probably the winningest guy. And he had COVID-19, and he was against vaccines, but he's had it, and he's recovered, and so he says, I'm not getting vaccinated, I don't need to, I got natural immunity. But because Australia says you have to be double vaccinated to come into the country, unless we give you an exemption, he asked for an exemption from the tennis club and the Australia, and they gave both of them. He got both. You're good to go. Got on a plane, you arrived there, they arrested him, and he's being detained in a hotel for people who came in illegally. The problem is, if he was allowed to play, and he won, he would have had more Grand Slam titles than any other person. Can you imagine the power, the honor and glory that he was going to be missed if he isn't allowed to play? At that point, he's going to scream bloody murder because of this and maybe sue the country for the loss of millions. He's made $7 million in 2021. He's going to make the same again in 2022, except maybe he won't get to play. And he won't, that possibility, it would be like Gretzky is ready to score the winning goal, his 740th goal, which will beat the next person, he'll have the most, and they say, no, you can't because this or that, and he says, but same thing for him. Well, we know that some people have to win and be covered in glory, but that wasn't Joshua. If you remember the Ten Commandments, the movie The Ten Commandments, and there's a picture of Charlton Heston, and his hair is blowing, and his robe is blowing, and he's standing with the staff over his head, and the water's parting because he was told to strike the water. And if you remember also that he used his staff to strike the rock, and water came out. But here's Joshua, none of that. He doesn't have a staff. He's not going to the Jordan. He's not going to strike the water. He's going to watch it happen from 3,000 feet away, and he's not even going to be part of it. Not even going to be in the same area. All of this is true, and everyone will see that this is God's doing. But it also says in verse 7, this day I begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel. In spite of the fact that he had nothing to do with this miracle, other than telling the priest to walk this way, go in that direction, people would still say, this is your part of this. We appreciate the fact that, and we're going to honor you like we honored Moses. Well, number 3 is delivery and promise. Delivery of the promise. Verse 13 says, this is God telling Joshua, it shall come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rise in the waters of Jordan. The waters of Jordan will be cut off, and the waters which are flowing down from above will stand in one heap. So when the people set off from their tents to cross the Jordan, with the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and when they have carried the Ark, those carrying the Ark come into the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the Ark were dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows its banks, all the days of the harvest. The waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in one heap, a great distance away at Adam. city which is beside Zarethan. And those that were flowing down toward the sea of Arabah, the salt sea, were completely cut off. So the people crossed opposite Jericho. And the priests who were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all the people crossed on dry ground until all the nation had finished crossing the Jordan. Now, this was beyond anything they had expected. They knew that, of course, that 40 years ago, some of them had crossed the Red Sea, those that were under 20 and under, and now we're almost 60. But the waters, it says the water was gone in both directions, as far as the eye could see. If you were in Moncton and the ark started to cross at the bridge, it would move all the way back to Hillsborough. That's how far away it would be, piled up in a pile. Some of the commentaries talk about this, and they say, they give dates where there was a mudslide and the water in the Jordan River was blocked, and they think this is what happened. And they say, well, it's a miracle in that the timing was so right. Joshua had the people march into the river, and the river was blocked. And it's still a miracle. But that's not what I don't buy that. I don't think it's that. Picture it this way. The river is at flood. It's flooding. It's overflowing its banks. And the priests walk into the water. Feet are in the water. Now, the mudslide happens 15 miles away. And even if the water is flowing at 15 miles an hour, it's an hour before you start to see the bottom of the water. All that water for 15 miles has to flow past him before they can. It's like the story of the guy who's fishing. And the guy says, you can't fish here. This is my lake. This is my river. This is my river. You're not allowed to fish here. So the fisherman steps up on a rock. He waits for 3 minutes and all the water flows by, and he says, there, your water's gone down. This is not your water anymore. That's the point, is that they would stand there for an hour before anything happened. And it also says that they crossed on dry land. Now, I was at Shearwater, and they were paving some of the airport, the runway. The runway is you can't have puddles on a runway. And so what they had was they would pave a section 10 feet wide, and then they'd skip a section and they'd pave another section. And the way it worked is they had this big mechanism with rails, and so it was perfectly level, and it moved along pouring concrete. And so that was perfectly level. It wasn't going downhill, it wasn't going uphill, there weren't any dips. Because you can't have a puddle. If you go to any parking lot that's a level parking lot, you'll see that there's dips. I remember when they did the basement of the house that I was building, it looked perfectly level, and then it rained. And there was puddles this deep in my basement. You see, that couldn't happen. And if that happened, it would be worse than a river. You can imagine what all that water had flown by, and unless it was perfectly smooth and a little bit of a slope, there would be places where the water would be 3 and 4 feet deep. A little dip where the water it'll just stay there. No, I believe God sucked that river dry, so there were no puddles and no muck, and he did it in both directions. And so no one down the river would say, do you remember when our great-great-grandfather talked about the river being blocked, and this must have happened again? No, nobody's going to say that. No one's going to say that. They're going to see this river is dry. This is not a natural occurrence. This did not happen other than by God. Jesus was asked for a sign. Give us a sign that you're the Messiah. And they had lots of signs. And so he refused. But any one of the people of Israel who walked across that river would believe that this was the hand of God. If you remember, it took a long time for the king of the Pharaoh of Egypt, to recognize the hand of God, but I'm sure he recognized it when his army was washed away from that dry land in the middle of the Red Sea. Now, let me review these interesting things that happened. The pillar of cloud and fire was gone. The river was dried up, which would not be muddy or puddles. And the people had to stay back 3,000 feet, which meant that if I called somebody and said, I'd like to have the Ark of the Covenant here in the driveway of the church, I'd like to have that phone call, by the way. But anyway, you know what I'm saying. Maple Street would be 3,000 feet away, and Mill Road would be 3,000 feet away. That's where the people would be. And that's where they would cross on dry land still. And 2 million people crossing, and their cattle, and their animals, and that's not a small, they're not single file. It's a big bunch of people crossing, and so they had to be a big area of river dry. And we know that the people in Jericho said that the gates were closed, and it was shut up tight. But the river had dried up 15 miles upstream and all the way to the Dead Sea. And lots of people would see this and put two and two together and say this was the hand of God. So what's the conclusion? God sometimes honors us in front of others, but not always. Sometimes serving requires us to be humbled. Jesus told this story in Luke 14, verse 7. He began speaking a miracle to the invited guests, and he noticed how they were picking up the places of honor at the table, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. He who has invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this man, and then in disgrace you will proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who has invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who are at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. What Jesus is saying, take the lower place and let them honor you, instead of demanding honor for yourself. There's a great story of this man who wants to be a missionary. And he's filled out the forms, and he's applied, and they've checked everything, and they invite him to come to that city to be interviewed. So he travels to the city. It's at 9 o'clock in the morning. He arrives at the office a little early so that he doesn't look like doesn't care. Quarter to 9, he comes in, he sits down. The secretary says, it may be a little while, we're having lots of stuff going on. So he sits there, 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock. Secretary comes over and says, would you like a coffee? The guy interviewing you has been detained. We don't want you to leave. Just stay, please. We want this to happen. Afternoon passes. She comes a couple more times, and it's 5 o'clock. Now 7 hours he sat waiting. And they said, please come back tomorrow. We apologize. Please come back tomorrow. Well, second day is a repeat of the first day. The coffee, no, please wait. Come back the third day. So he comes back the third day, and he sits, and it's a repeat of day 1 and day 2. And then in the afternoon, they say, come on in for your interview. And so they have a little small talk and a chat, And they let him have the opportunity to blast them for making him wait 3 days. And he doesn't. And they said, well, thank you, the job's yours. And he's mystified. I haven't had an interview. I just said, well, he said the interview was you sitting for 3 days. If you can be humble enough to say, I'm setting aside my pride and I'll sit here because these people want me to. That's what happened. He got the job. God may choose to set us in places of the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites were the guys that hauled water and split wood all their lives, and their children and their children's children after them, for the sanctuary. That's what they did. Nothing important. Just the same old stuff over and over again. No important job for us, but one that calls for a humble spirit. Joshua didn't get to play the part of Charles Heston with his staff. He just got to walk along with the rest of them, 3,000 feet away, looking at what was happening and watching it. Now, the Kohathites had to give up their most important job to the people that had the most important job in the whole of the nation of Israel. How come these people with the most important job gets to take our most important job? Well, they had to humbly and politely accept it. And they hadn't failed in their job as far as we know. There's nothing that says these people had done wrong. God chose a different way and they had to accept it. We need to be people who are willing to carry the load and allow other people to get the credit. We don't know if God has a purpose for that. How come we do all the work and we get none of the credit and this other person is lavished with credit? Well, we don't know if God has decided to do a test like they did with the missionary. We're going to heap all this praise on you and see if it goes to your head. Bigger and bigger and bigger, or you give the praise back to God. This wasn't me, this is all God. All of this, all this blessing, all that you tried to praise me for is all God. We need to be able to say in our little church that we're willing and happy to spend our energy lifting other people up and letting anything of ourselves be the lifting up be the work of God. And in His time, the honor we should want is the honor of being told, well done, good and faithful servants. Enter into the